Ravi had always lived a quiet life near the wide river that ran past his land. His family had owned that land for generations. It was not just a piece of soil for him, but a part of his soul. The land stretched across green fields, shaded woods, and ended at a small dam his grandfather had built many years ago. That dam was not a big concrete wall like the ones people see in cities. It was simple but strong, built with stones and heavy beams, and it gave Ravi control over the flow of water that filled the small valley below. Over time, the dam created a beautiful lake where fish swam and birds rested. It was his pride, and he never let anyone touch it. For years, Ravi believed his land was safe. He lived peacefully, taking care of his crops, fixing fences, and walking the riverbanks at sunset. He did not expect that strangers would one day arrive with strange papers, promises, and plans that had nothing to do with him. It began quietly. At first, a few surveyors walked around the far edge of his property. Ravi thought they were just workers passing through. Then he noticed new wooden stakes driven into the ground with bright ribbons tied to them. He frowned but did not worry too much, thinking it must be some mistake. One morning, as he walked toward the lake, he heard hammering. The sound was sharp and quick, echoing across the hills. Ravi followed the sound and froze in shock. There were men working on wooden frames, building cabins right on his land near the lake. He counted 4 cabins already standing and many more under construction. The men wore uniforms with the logo of a local homeowners association, known as the HOA. Ravi had heard of them before but never cared about their business. Now it seemed they had chosen his land as their new vacation project. He shouted at the workers, asking what they were doing. One of them looked up and said calmly that the cabins were part of a vacation community planned by the HOA. They spoke as if they owned the place, as if Ravi's land was theirs. Ravi's anger boiled, but the workers told him to speak with their manager if he had questions. That very day, Ravi rode his motorbike to the office of the HOA in town. Inside the office, he found a man named David, sitting behind a wide desk with polished files and papers stacked neatly. Ravi explained that cabins were being built on his land without his permission. David smiled politely, but not kindly. He said the HOA had already approved the project with the town council. According to him, the land around the lake had been listed for community development. Ravi shook his head, pointing out that the land belonged to him, that he had the deeds, and that no one had the right to build without his consent. David leaned back in his chair and said calmly that sometimes land ownership could be complicated. He told Ravi that the lake area was now marked as recreational land for the town, and the HOA had a right to develop it. Ravi left the office with fire in his chest. He knew his grandfather's papers were clear. His rights were real and no one had ever disputed them before. Still, the HOA behaved as though they held the power. Days passed and construction grew faster. More cabins appeared by the shore. Soon there were dozens and then hundreds of frames lined the water. Workers hauled timber, poured cement, and painted roofs. Ravi could hear their tools even at night. His peaceful home had turned into a noisy construction zone. He stood at the dam every evening, staring at the water that fed the new cabin's foundations, feeling betrayed by the system that was supposed to protect him. Neighbors told him not to fight. They whispered that the HOA was too powerful, that they had connections with council members and lawyers. Some said Ravi should sell the land for whatever price he could get and leave. But Ravi was not the kind of man who gave up easily. His grandfather had built the dam with his own hands. His father had tilled the soil through drought and storm. Now it was his turn to defend it. One evening, Ravi walked down the lakeshore and saw a family standing outside one of the nearly finished cabins. They were smiling, talking about how peaceful their vacation would be once the project opened. The children pointed at the lake, laughing at the ducks swimming there. Ravi felt a mix of sadness and fury. Those people believed they were buying dreams, but their dreams stood on stolen ground. He went home and pulled out the old chest where his family's papers were kept. Inside lay the deeds, maps, and even the original blueprints of the dam. He placed them on the table and studied every line. The land was his. The lake was his. Yet the cabins kept rising. One morning, Ravi drove to the town hall with the documents in his bag. He demanded to see an official. The clerk at the desk looked nervous as he explained that the HOA had already secured temporary permits. Ravi argued that the permits were illegal because the land was private. The clerk lowered his voice and said there was little he could do. The council had signed agreements, and unless Ravi filed a case in court, the project would continue. Ravi stepped out of the building, breathing heavily. He could file a case, yes, but court cases dragged on for years. By the time a judge gave a ruling, the cabins would already be finished, sold, and lived in. He imagined 193 families enjoying vacations on his land while he stood powerless. That thought broke something deep inside him. From that day, Ravi began to observe carefully. He watched how the cabins were built, how the workers took water from the lake, and how the HOA set up paths and docks along the shore. He noticed something important. Every single cabin relied on the lake. Without the lake, the cabins would lose their charm, their value, and their very reason for being. The lake was the heart of the project, and the lake existed only because of the dam his grandfather had built. That dam was the key. He walked to the dam at dusk and ran his hand over the old gate. It was strong but simple. If he opened it, the water would rush out. The lake would shrink back into the riverbed, leaving behind muddy banks. Without the lake, the cabins would be useless. For the first time, a strange idea entered his mind. He could fight the HOA not with papers or lawyers, but with nature itself. Still, Ravi was not reckless. He did not act right away. He spent nights thinking, weighing the risks. He asked himself if it was fair to let the lake drain, to let the cabins stand empty. He thought about the birds, the fish, and the trees that had grown around the water. He loved the lake, yet he loved justice more. If they wanted to take his land, they had to face what kept it alive. By the end of the month, nearly 193 cabins stood on his land. Some were finished, painted, and decorated. Others were waiting for doors and windows. Trucks moved in and out carrying furniture. The HOA announced proudly that their vacation retreat would soon be ready for visitors. They promised fresh air, peaceful waters, and unforgettable memories by the lake. Ravi read their advertisements in the newspaper with clenched fists. They were selling his land as if he did not exist. One night, Ravi walked once more to the dam. The moon reflected on the calm surface of the lake. He listened to the croak of frogs and the soft splash of fish. Then he looked at the cabins lined up like invaders on the far shore. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself that if no one else would protect his land, then he would. He placed his hand firmly on the dam gate, feeling its weight, and made up his mind. The war with the HOA had just begun, but Ravi knew the true weapon lay not in papers or meetings. It lay in the flow of water, the power of the river, and the strength of nature waiting behind the gate. Ravi's decision was not born out of anger alone. It grew slowly, like a seed planted deep in his heart. He had spent nights pacing the floor of his small home, staring at the old papers spread out on the table, reading them again and again. Every map, every signature, every stamp confirmed the truth. The land was his. Yet the HOA ignored that truth, turning his home into their business. Ravi was not a man of violence, and he had never raised his hand against anyone. But the injustice pushed him to a point where silence felt heavier than action. The next morning, Ravi returned to the lake to watch the progress of the cabins. Workers were everywhere. Some were hammering planks, some were painting fences, and others were carrying tiles for the roofs. The cabins looked neat and modern, lined in perfect rows. By now, nearly all 193 were close to completion. Ravi stood in the shade of a tree unseen and observed them closely. He noticed how every cabin had wide windows facing the lake. Wooden decks stretched toward the water, and small boats tied to the docks waited for families who would one day arrive for vacations. Without the lake, these cabins were just empty shells. As Ravi watched, 2 men in suits arrived in a shiny car. They walked around with clipboards pointing at the cabins and making notes. They laughed and smiled as if everything was perfect. Ravi recognized one of them. It was David, the manager he had met at the HOA office. The sight of him made Ravi's chest tighten. David walked proudly, showing the other man the cabins like a king showing off his palace. Ravi clenched his fists but stayed quiet. He was not ready to confront them yet. Later that day, Ravi went into town to visit his old friend Arjun. Arjun ran a small hardware store and had always been supportive of Ravi. Inside the shop, the smell of wood and paint filled the air. Ravi leaned on the counter and shared his worries. Arjun listened carefully, his brow furrowed. "They have no right," Ravi said firmly. "This land has belonged to my family for generations. The lake exists only because of my grandfather's dam, and now they think they can sell it like it's theirs." Arjun sighed. "I know, Ravi, but the HOA is powerful. They have money, lawyers, and the council on their side. Fighting them in court could take years. Ravi nodded slowly. That's why I must think differently. They are depending on the lake. Without it, the cabins lose everything. Arjun looked at him in surprise. You are not thinking of draining it, are you? Ravi did not answer directly. He only said, I am thinking of what my grandfather would do if someone tried to steal his work. He built the dam with his own hands. He believed in protecting what was ours. Arjun shook his head with concern but did not argue further. He knew Ravi well enough to understand that once his mind was set, he would not turn back. Over the next week, Ravi began preparing quietly. He spent time at the dam, inspecting the gate carefully. The wood and metal were old but strong. He oiled the hinges and checked the locks. He measured how quickly the water would flow if the gate was opened. He remembered stories his father had told him of times when the family had to lower the water during heavy rains. The system still worked. All it needed was his decision. Meanwhile, the HOA continued to advertise their new vacation retreat. Posters appeared in town showing bright pictures of families smiling by the lake. The brochures promised peaceful mornings, joyful afternoons, and magical nights by the water. Ravi read those words and felt the weight of betrayal pressing on him. They were selling dreams built on his stolen land. One afternoon, as Ravi walked near the cabins, a group of buyers arrived for a tour. They were families with children, walking happily along the paths as David guided them. Ravi stayed hidden among the trees and listened. David spoke proudly of the lake, describing it as a natural treasure. He pointed to the dam and said, This has been here for years and it gives the lake its charm. It will always be here to keep the water steady. Hearing those words made Ravi's heart pound. David was using his grandfather's creation as a selling point, while denying Ravi's right to the land. Ravi turned away, shaking with anger but also with resolve. He whispered to himself that if they wanted to depend on the dam, then they would have to face what it meant when the dam's master refused to cooperate. That night, Ravi sat on his porch, staring at the stars. He thought about his family, about the generations before him who had worked on the land. He thought about the quiet mornings he had enjoyed by the lake, fishing or simply watching the sunrise. He thought about the laughter of the children who used to swim there in summer. The land was not just soil and water. It was memory, history, and life, and it was his duty to protect it. But Ravi was also wise enough to know he had to be careful. He could not act too soon. If he opened the gate immediately, the HOA might accuse him of sabotage. He needed the right moment. So he waited, watching as the cabins neared completion. By the middle of the month, the HOA held an opening ceremony. They invited officials from the council, business partners, and journalists. A stage was set up by the shore, decorated with flowers and banners. Ravi stood far away on a hill, looking down at the scene. He saw David giving speeches, the council members clapping, and photographers taking pictures of the shiny new cabins. Fireworks burst into the sky and people cheered. It was a grand celebration, but to Ravi it felt like an insult carved into his land. After the ceremony, families began moving into the cabins for trial stays. Cars filled the parking lots, children ran along the docks, and lights sparkled in the windows. Ravi watched silently, hidden in the shadows of the trees. His land was no longer quiet. It was crowded and noisy, full of strangers who believed they had found paradise. None of them knew the truth. None of them understood that the paradise stood only because of him. One evening, as Ravi stood by the dam, he heard laughter across the lake. A group of visitors were having a party on their deck, music echoing over the water. Ravi closed his eyes, remembering how peaceful the valley had once been. He knew then that the time was close. He could not allow the HOA to claim victory. Before taking any step, Ravi decided to give the HOA one final chance. The next day, he walked into their office again, carrying the deed and documents. He placed them on David's desk and said firmly, "This is proof. This land is mine. Stop building. Stop selling. Leave before it is too late." David barely glanced at the papers. He smiled with the same polite arrogance as before and said, "Mr. Ravi, the cabins are complete. Families have already moved in. The council supports us. If you wish to argue, take it to court. But you cannot stop us." Ravi's hands trembled with restrained anger. He gathered the papers, looked David in the eye and said quietly, "Then you have chosen this path yourself." With that, he turned and left the office without another word. That night, Ravi stood at the dam again. The moonlight shimmered on the calm water, and the cabins glowed with lights on the shore. He placed his hand on the heavy gate, feeling its rough surface. He whispered to the spirit of his grandfather, asking for strength. The decision was made. Soon the water that gave life to the cabins would return to its river path, but Ravi was not hasty. He decided to wait for the perfect moment, when all the cabins were filled with guests and the HOA had invested everything into their project. Only then would the opening of the gate deliver the message clearly. He wanted them to see with their own eyes that their empire stood on borrowed land and borrowed water. The days that followed were filled with planning. Ravi prepared tools, checked the gate again, and marked the best time to act. He told no one, not even Arjun. This was his battle and he would carry it alone. The silence gave him strength. At night, when the valley echoed with music and laughter from the cabins, Ravi would sit near the dam, watching and waiting. He imagined the moment the water would rush out, the lake shrinking before their eyes and the cabins standing useless on dry land. He imagined David's face when he realized that all his work, all his pride, depended on the man he had ignored. The choice was made, and there was no turning back. Ravi had tried warnings, he had shown proof, he had spoken with calm. The HOA refused to listen. Now nature itself would speak for him, and when it did, no counsel, no lawyer, and no amount of money could silence it. Ravi stood tall, his shadow stretching across the dam. The time was coming. Ravi's days became heavier as the cabins around the lake filled with people. He had expected the HOA to take some time before inviting guests, but soon advertisements spread across nearby towns. Families, tourists, and weekend visitors arrived in large numbers. Cars lined the dirt roads, boats floated on the calm water, and music drifted across the valley every night. Ravi, who once enjoyed evenings of silence, now heard laughter, shouting, and even fireworks above the trees. He tried to remind himself to stay calm. The moment for his plan was close, but he wanted it to strike with the greatest effect. Each day he studied the cabins from a distance, noting how fully they relied on the lake. Without the reflection of water, without the soft waves lapping against the docks, the cabins lost their value. They would stand empty, like wooden boxes in a field. This thought gave Ravi patience even when his heart ached with anger. One Saturday, the HOA organized a grand event at the retreat. Tents were set up near the shore, and stalls sold food and drinks. Music played loudly and children ran around carrying balloons. Ravi stood hidden in the woods watching. David walked among the crowd, shaking hands and speaking proudly about the success of the project. Journalists took photographs and local officials gave speeches praising the HOA for bringing life to the valley. Ravi nearly laughed at the words. They called it life, but for him, it was theft dressed as celebration. Ravi returned home that night and opened the wooden chest where his family's papers were stored. He held the old deeds in his hands, tracing the faded ink with his fingers. He thought of his grandfather, who had built the dam not just to hold water but to create a future for the family. He thought of his father, who had protected the land through storms and droughts. Their spirits seemed to whisper to him that he was the last line of defense. He was not just fighting for himself but for all who came before him. The next morning, Arjun visited him. He had heard about the event and knew Ravi must be restless. Arjun tried to speak gently. Ravi, maybe it is time to let go. These people are powerful. You are alone. If you fight them, you may lose everything. Ravi shook his head firmly. I am not afraid of losing, Arjun. I am afraid of doing nothing. If I stay silent, then they win forever. But if I act, at least I will know I tried. Arjun sighed deeply, realizing that Ravi's heart was set. He did not press further. Instead, he offered a word of caution. Be careful, my friend. Whatever you choose, make sure it is clear that the land was always yours. Ravi nodded. He appreciated Arjun's concern but knew the burden was his alone. The following week, the cabins buzzed with more activity. The HOA announced a full opening, promising entertainment, fishing trips, and boat rides for visitors. More people poured in, filling every cabin. The retreat had become the talk of the town. From the hill above the valley, Ravi could see lines of light shining like a festival each night. It felt like the intruders had completely taken over his world. But what they did not know was that the very heart of their retreat pulsed, only because Ravi allowed it. Every drop of water in that lake was held back by the dam his grandfather had built. Without the gate closed, the water would slip away, rushing back into the river, leaving only cracked mud and empty docks. The cabins would not be worth a single coin. Ravi held that power in his hands, and soon he would use it. Still, he waited a little longer. He wanted the cabins to be completely filled, the HOA to believe their success was unshakable. The higher their pride climbed, the sharper their fall would be. One night, Ravi walked quietly along the edge of the lake. Lanterns glowed on the decks of the cabins, and music carried across the water. He crouched low among the reeds, watching families enjoy themselves. A group of children were laughing as they threw stones into the water, while their parents roasted food on a small fire. Ravi's heart softened for a moment. These families were not his enemies. They did not know the truth. They had been fooled into thinking they were guests in a paradise. His anger was not at them, but at the HOA that had stolen his land and lied to everyone. He turned his gaze to the dam. The moonlight shone on the strong wooden gate. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice reminding him that control of the water meant control of the land. Ravi whispered to himself, "The time is near." A few days later, the HOA held a gathering for investors. Wealthy men and women came to see the retreat. They toured the cabins, ate food by the shore, and discussed profits. David stood proudly on a stage, boasting that the retreat was the future of the valley. He promised expansion, more cabins, and even a small shopping area nearby. The crowd cheered. Ravi watched from the distance, his jaw tight. Expansion meant more theft. They would not stop until everything was gone. That evening, Ravi returned home and prepared for what lay ahead. He gathered tools, an old lantern, a sturdy rope, and an iron lever he had once used for heavy work. He sharpened his mind as much as his tools, reminding himself of every detail. The dam was old but strong. The gate would need effort to open, but once moved, the river would take care of the rest. He knew where to stand, how to pull, and how quickly the water would surge. On the final night before his action, Ravi could not sleep. He sat outside, listening to the distant sound of music and laughter from the cabins. He looked at the stars above and thought about his family. He thought about the silence that had once filled the valley, a silence now broken by strangers. He thought about the soil, the trees, the water, and the duty he carried. When dawn approached, he stood and whispered, "It is time." The valley was quiet when Ravi reached the dam. Mist rose from the water and birds stirred in the trees. He placed his lantern on a stone and gripped the heavy gate. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of the moment. He pulled once, testing the resistance. The wood creaked and the iron hinges groaned. He pulled harder, feeling the strength of the river pressing behind the barrier. Slowly, the gate shifted. A stream of water burst through, spraying into the air. Ravi braced himself and pulled with all his might. The gate swung wider and the water roared out like a beast released from its cage. The calm lake began to swirl as the level dropped. Waves rolled toward the shore, shaking the docks. Boats tilted and banged against the wood. The cabins, once reflected in the smooth water, now faced a rushing current. Ravi stepped back, watching the river reclaim its path. He felt both sorrow and relief. Sorrow because the lake he loved was vanishing before his eyes. Relief because justice was finally moving. Nature itself was answering the injustice. Within hours, the lake shrank dramatically. Mud appeared along the edges, docks hung useless above the ground, and boats lay stranded. By afternoon, visitors noticed the change. Families stood on decks, pointing nervously at the dropping water. Children asked questions and parents frowned. Panic spread as the water level fell lower and lower. The HOA rushed to calm everyone. Workers ran to the shore, shouting orders. David himself appeared, his face pale as he watched the lake drain. He barked commands, telling people it was a minor problem, that it would be fixed soon. But Ravi knew better. The water was not returning. The lake existed only because the dam gate was closed, and now it was open. Ravi stood on the hill, watching the chaos below. The cabins, once full of laughter, now echoed with confusion and fear. Guests packed their bags, cars lined up to leave, and the retreat lost its charm in a single day. The mighty HOA, which had boasted of success, was now scrambling helplessly. For the first time in weeks, Ravi felt peace. He had not lifted a weapon. He had not shouted in anger. He had only allowed nature to take its course. The water had always belonged to the river, just as the land had always belonged to him. The battle was not over. Ravi knew the HOA would fight back with words, with lawyers, and with accusations. But he had shown them the truth. Their empire was fragile, built on what was never theirs, and now the whole town had seen it collapse in a single day. The valley grew quiet again that night. The cabins stood in darkness, empty and powerless without the lake. The moon rose above the dam, and Ravi sat on a stone, breathing deeply. He knew more challenges lay ahead, but his heart was steady. He had made his move, and the world had heard it loud and clear. The fight with the HOA had entered a new stage. The valley looked different after the water escaped. Where there had once been a shining lake, only patches of mud and shallow pools remained. Wooden docks leaned awkwardly, and small boats sat tilted in the dirt. The cabins, built proudly by the HOA, now faced empty ground. What had been sold as a paradise by the water had turned into a broken dream. Ravi stood on the hill, overlooking everything. He felt both pride and sadness. Pride, because he had defended his land without lifting a weapon. Sadness, because the lake that had been a part of his life was gone. The fish struggled in the shrinking pools. Birds circled in confusion, and the trees that once leaned over calm water now hung above cracked mud. It was painful to see, but Ravi reminded himself why he had done it. The HOA had stolen his land, ignored his voice, and turned his home into their business. Now they were forced to face the truth. The news spread quickly. Visitors who had come for vacations packed their bags and left. Families complained loudly, saying they had been promised a beautiful retreat but had instead found disaster. Cars streamed out of the valley, leaving behind empty cabins. Within days, the retreat that had been full of laughter became silent. The HOA tried to cover their failure by posting signs that repairs were underway, but no one believed them. Everyone in town had seen the water vanish, and they whispered about the man who owned the dam. In the center of the storm stood David, the manager of the HOA project. He was furious. He stormed into his office, shouting at his staff. Papers flew and phones rang non-stop with complaints. Investors demanded answers. Officials questioned him, and workers refused to continue without pay. For David, the retreat had turned from his greatest success into his worst nightmare. He knew exactly who was responsible. Ravi, he muttered under his breath. That stubborn farmer. He thinks he can ruin us. He will regret this. David called an emergency meeting with the HOA board. They sat around a long table, their faces tense. One board member said, "The water is gone. Without the lake, the cabins are useless. Guests have left and our reputation is damaged." Another added, "We invested millions into this project. Investors are angry. The council is asking questions. What are we going to do?" David slammed his fist on the table. "We are going to fight. That man opened the dam and destroyed our lake. We will take him to court. We will claim damages. He will pay for every coin we lost." The board nodded in agreement, though worry lingered in their eyes. They knew Ravi held the original deeds, and the town had begun to sympathize with him. But the HOA was not ready to give up. They had money, influence, and lawyers, and they would use them all. Meanwhile, Ravi returned to his simple routine. He walked his fields, repaired fences, and visited the river. Life on his land felt quiet again, even though the valley looked different without the lake. Arjun came to see him one evening. He looked at the dry banks and shook his head. "You really did it," Arjun said softly. "The whole town is talking. Some people call you brave, others call you foolish. They say the HOA will come after you." Ravi looked at his friend calmly. "I did what I had to do. They would not listen to my words. They would not respect my papers. So I let the river speak for me." Arjun sighed. "Be ready, Ravi. This fight is not over. They will not accept defeat so easily." Ravi knew his friend was right. Still, his heart was steady. He had no fear of the HOA's power. They might have lawyers and officials, but he had the truth, and he had nature on his side. The very next week, a letter arrived at Ravi's home. It was thick, stamped with seals and filled with legal words. The HOA had filed a case against him, accusing him of sabotage, destruction, and financial damage. They demanded compensation that reached beyond imagination. Ravi read the letter carefully, then folded it and placed it on the table. He felt no panic. He knew this was coming. Instead of fear, Ravi felt determination. He gathered his documents, the old deeds, maps, and records of the dam. He visited the town lawyer, an elderly man named Prakash who had once worked with his father. Prakash adjusted his glasses and read through the papers. After a long silence, he looked at Ravi. "You are right," Prakash said firmly. "The land and the dam are yours. The HOA had no legal right to build those cabins. If they want to fight in court, we will fight. You have the truth on your side. Ravi nodded in gratitude. For the first time in weeks, he felt supported. When the court hearings began, the whole town paid attention. People filled the benches, whispering as Ravi stood calmly on one side and David sat with his lawyers on the other. David's face was tight with anger while Ravi's was steady with resolve. The HOA's lawyers argued loudly, claiming Ravi had destroyed a community project and caused great financial loss. They painted him as selfish, unwilling to share the land for the good of the town. But when it was Ravi's turn, Prakash presented the deeds, the maps, and the history of the dam. He showed that the lake existed only because of Ravi's family's work, and that the land had never been sold or given to the HOA. The judge listened carefully. Days turned into weeks as the hearings continued. Witnesses came forward. Some workers admitted they had built cabins without ever seeing Ravi's permission. Neighbors testified that Ravi had owned the land for generations. Even council members hesitated when asked about the permits. Slowly, the truth unfolded. Outside the courtroom, people debated. Some said Ravi was right to defend his land. Others said draining the lake was extreme. But most agreed on one thing. The HOA had been arrogant and they had ignored the rightful owner. David grew more frustrated with each hearing. His voice rose, his hands shook, and his pride crumbled. He had once spoken like a king of the valley, but now he looked cornered. Ravi, on the other hand, remained calm. He did not boast, he did not shout. He simply stood with his papers, letting the truth speak for itself. During one session, the judge looked directly at David and asked, "Did you ever receive written permission from Mr. Ravi to build these cabins?" David hesitated, then admitted, "No." That single word echoed in the courtroom. People whispered, and Ravi felt a quiet victory in his heart. Weeks later, the judge delivered his decision. The cabins had been built illegally on private land. The HOA had no right to sell or use them. The land, including the dam in the valley, belonged fully to Ravi. The case of financial damages against him was dismissed. Instead, the judge ordered the HOA to clear the cabins and return the land to its rightful state. The courtroom filled with murmurs. Ravi stood tall, his heart swelling with relief. He had not just defended his land, but also proven the strength of truth against power. David sat frozen, his dreams of wealth collapsing like sandcastles washed away by the tide. The days that followed were filled with activity. Workers dismantled the cabins piece by piece. Trucks carried away wood, tiles, and furniture. The valley slowly emptied, returning to silence. For Ravi, it was a bittersweet sight. The cabins were gone, but so was the lake. The valley looked bare, scarred by what had happened. One evening, Ravi walked to the dam. The gate still stood open, the river flowing freely beyond. He placed his hand on the wood and thought of his grandfather. He knew he could close the gate again, let the water rise, and bring the lake back. But he hesitated. Part of him wondered if the lake should remain as it was, a reminder that no one could take the land without respect. As he stood there, the wind rustled through the trees, and the river whispered softly. Ravi closed his eyes, feeling peace settle in his heart. He had fought his battle, and he had won. The HOA was gone, their pride shattered, their cabins dismantled. The valley was his again. But deep down, Ravi knew the story was not finished. The land was safe, but its future remained uncertain. Should he rebuild the lake? Should he leave it to nature? These questions lingered, but Ravi was in no hurry to answer them. For now he had silence, he had truth, and he had the memory of victory. The battle had ended, but the journey of the land was still unfolding. The valley was quiet again, but it was a silence filled with questions. With the cabins gone and the lake drained, the place no longer looked like the retreat that had attracted visitors from distant towns. Instead, it looked raw, like a wound still healing. Broken paths led to empty foundations where cabins once stood, and the trees reflected on shallow puddles instead of a great shining lake. Ravi often stood on the hill, watching the land and thinking about what it should become. Many people came to meet him after the court victory. Some congratulated him, praising his courage. Others asked what he planned to do with the land. Farmers wanted him to expand the fields. Merchants suggested he open a market. Some even encouraged him to rebuild the lake and invite visitors again, but under his own control. Everyone seemed to have ideas, yet Ravi stayed silent, listening to all but deciding nothing. He believed land had its own way of speaking, and only patience would reveal its path. Arjun visited often, bringing news from town. The HOA has lost its name, Arjun told him one evening. No one trusts them anymore. Investors have pulled out, and even their office in town has shut down. David left quietly. Some say he moved to another city. Others say he has gone into hiding because people are angry with him. You may not realize it, Ravi, but you have changed the balance of power here. Ravi looked at his friend. I did not fight for power, Arjun, I fought for truth. But now I carry the weight of what comes next. The land is mine, but what will it become? That is the greater question. Arjun nodded. Whatever you choose, people will watch. Some will support you, some will not. But remember, this valley is no longer only yours in people's eyes. Everyone has seen the struggle, and they will care about its future. Those words stayed with Ravi. He began to walk the valley each morning, studying the soil, the river, and the bare foundations. He touched the bark of old trees, listened to the sound of birds, and watched the clouds drift above. Slowly, an idea began to grow in his mind. One afternoon, while resting by the river, Ravi imagined children running through fields, families walking on shaded paths, and visitors learning about the history of the land. Not cabins of greed, but open spaces of harmony. He thought of his grandfather, who had built the dam not for business but for survival, sharing water with neighbors and helping the community. The land, Ravi realized, was never meant to be locked away or sold like an object. It was meant to be lived with, respected, and shared. The next week, Ravi called a gathering. He invited farmers, neighbors, elders, and even young students from the town. They all met in the valley where the lake once had been. Ravi stood before them, the afternoon sun behind him, and spoke clearly. This land has seen pride and greed, and it has seen truth and struggle, Ravi said. The HOA tried to take it and use it for their gain. I fought to protect it, but I do not wish to keep it only for myself. This valley belongs to the earth, and we are only its caretakers. I wish to turn this place into a sanctuary not for profit, but for people and nature together. The crowd listened closely. Some whispered, surprised at his words. Ravi continued, We will plant trees. We will create walking paths. We will let the river flow freely. Children will come here to learn about the earth. Families will come to rest in peace, not luxury. Farmers will share knowledge, and students will study the history of this dam and this valley. This will not be a retreat of money, but a sanctuary of harmony. There was silence after he finished. Then an elder stepped forward. He placed his hand on Ravi's shoulder and said, Your grandfather would be proud. You are giving life to the land, not taking from it. Others began to nod, and slowly the crowd filled with approval. From that day, the work began. Farmers brought seeds and young trees. Children carried small plants in baskets. Women brought tools, and men helped clear the broken remains of the cabins. Together, they planted rows of trees, built benches from stone, and shaped paths through the valley. The river became the heart of the sanctuary, and near its banks, they built a small platform for gatherings and lessons. Ravi worked alongside everyone, sweating under the sun, carrying wood and planting with his own hands. He felt joy rise in him as he saw the valley change again, not into a false paradise of cabins, but into a living, breathing place of peace. Months passed, and the valley grew green again. Young trees stretched upward, flowers bloomed, and birds returned in greater numbers. The sound of laughter filled the air as children visited with their teachers. They learned about the dam, about water, and about the value of protecting land. Families came to rest under the shade, bringing food to share. The valley became a place of togetherness, not division. One evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the sky orange, Ravi and Arjun sat on a stone bench. They looked at the river flowing gently and the trees swaying in the breeze. Arjun smiled. You did it, Ravi. You turned loss into life. You gave the land a new story. Ravi shook his head softly. It was not me alone, Arjun. The people did it. The land guided us. I only listened. Arjun leaned back, watching the sky. Still, you showed courage. You could have rebuilt the lake for profit, but you chose a different path. That will be remembered. Ravi smiled faintly. If people remember anything, let it be this. The land does not belong to us. We belong to the land. When we forget that, we invite pride and destruction. When we remember it, we find peace. Years passed, and the sanctuary flourished. Trees grew tall, their branches heavy with leaves. Birds nested, animals returned, and the river sparkled like silver under the sun. Travelers came not for luxury but for learning and peace. The valley became known as a place of truth, where people were reminded of the bond between land and life. The cabins of the HOA were forgotten, their memory fading like shadows in the wind. But Ravi's sanctuary lived on, not as a monument to one man but as a gift to generations. Children who once planted saplings grew into adults who returned with their own children, showing them the trees they had placed in the soil. Elders came to rest, whispering stories of the struggle and the victory of truth. Ravi himself grew older, his hair turning silver, but his eyes remained calm. Every morning he walked the paths of the sanctuary, greeting people with warmth and checking the river with care. When he stood by the dam, he no longer felt the weight of decision. He had chosen wisely. The gate remained open, the water flowing freely, a symbol of freedom and balance. One day, standing by the river with a group of children, Ravi told them, "This place is yours now. Protect it, care for it, and never forget that the earth speaks to those who listen." The children nodded with bright eyes, carrying his words like seeds in their hearts. In the end, Ravi found peace not by holding on to the land as possession, but by giving it life through sharing. The valley that had once been scarred by greed became whole again, healed by truth and unity. And though time moved on, the story of the farmer and his sanctuary lived in every tree, every ripple of water, and every heart that stepped into the valley. It was not a tale of victory over enemies, but a tale of harmony with the earth. And that harmony, once found, could never be taken away.